all the wonderful things. All right, welcome all those who are on our YouTube channel. We're going to start off by watching the recap of story of the last couple weeks, and then we'll watch the scene from this week, Joseph from slave to Pharaoh.
There once was a man named Abram. God made a promise. I will make you into a great nation, and all of the people on earth will be blessed through you. God changed their names to Abraham and Sarah, exactly as God promised. Sarah became pregnant. God told Abraham to take his son up on a mountain and sacrifice him. But an angel stopped Abraham, and God provided a ram to sacrifice in place of Isaac. Isaac married and had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was Isaac's favorite, but Jacob wanted the inheritance. Confused, Isaac gave his blessing to Jacob and promised him the inheritance. And like his father, Jacob had a favorite son. Little did Jacob know that his favoritism would put his son, Joseph, in danger of being killed by his own brothers. Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was Joseph. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were working in the field. Joseph's brothers resented him, and when they saw him coming, they attacked him and threw him in the well. Then they sold their brother as a slave, took off his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, tricking him into believing a wild animal had killed Joseph. Soon after, Joseph was sold to a military official in Egypt as a servant. God helped Joseph do great work, and the official was very happy with him. Joseph was very handsome, and the official's wife tried day after day to seduce him. One day, she pressured Joseph so much that he ran out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She told everyone that he tried to force himself on her. The official was furious and threw Joseph in jail. God once again helped Joseph in all he did. And eventually, he was put in charge of all the prisoners. Joseph had a special ability to interpret people's dreams. One day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. He dreamed that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and 7 heads of healthy grain were eaten up by 7 heads of dried up grain. God helped Joseph interpret the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of successful farming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was impressed and put Joseph second in charge of Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food. When they got there, they met with Joseph, but didn't recognize him right away. When Joseph finally told them who he was, they wept because they were sorry for what they had done. Eventually, they went and got their father Jacob and brought him back to Egypt. Joseph took care of his entire family, giving them property in the best part of the land where they lived for the rest of their lives.
All right, so as we get started, I'd like for you, and online you're going to be one giant group, but for those of you who are gathered here, we're going to do this. I want to take the first couple minutes and find a partner or pair up in 2s or 3s, and I want you to talk about what is one question that you had and what is one insight that you had, one thing maybe you hadn't heard before or read before or didn't remember. And so what's one insight you had from the reading this week? And what is one question that you had from the reading this week that came up? I'll keep the time. I'll mute us in here. You guys can be one giant group because it's hard to partner up. I'm sure there's a way to do that, but I don't know how. So we'll come back together in just a little bit.
Okay, so everybody's going to need to unmute. So yeah, anybody had thoughts, questions?
One thing at the Monday evening men's fellowship, we did the same thing, or not the questions as far as what we're doing now, but one thing that I pointed out was that Pastor Tim had asked about Joseph's coat being long sleeved, and someone mentioned, oh, it was to shield his arms from the sun, but then I mentioned about, oh, it means that he's not a laborer like his brothers, which Pastor Tim picked up on too, saying, yeah, that's it. He's not a laborer, and that's part of the jealousy that added into the dream capability of interpreting the dreams. So yeah, that was the coat was multicolored, supposedly, but long sleeve, meaning that he was not a laborer by any means, and more of a supervisor possibly over his brothers.
I never would have picked up on that long sleeves had a status.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding clothes. I didn't understand if when you would read, they would get upset and they tore their clothes. What does that
Oh
mean?
yeah.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, that thank you for bringing that up, Karen. I didn't think about that either.
Yeah, and you saw that a lot whenever they got upset or something and they knew they were wrong. They tore their clothes, and I don't know what that means. So we'll have to ask Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Google.
Yeah.
I have a question on page 41. That paragraph, second paragraph down, it mentions Jacob having his son Joseph put his hand, maybe it's not Joseph, but what's the point about putting your hand under my thigh? What's that all about? Did anybody else wonder about that?
Yeah, I wondered about that too.
I did too.
Put your hand under my thigh and promise. So I wonder if it has something to do with that whole routine of how you promise. It's new to me. And under my thigh, does just that, maybe he can clarify what that means.
Yeah.
It sounds sexual, but I don't think it.
Yeah, probably not. I remember reading that. I'm having trouble finding it in the text right now, but I know what you're talking about.
That's on page 41 and
yeah, I'm looking there.
the
I'm not
first
seeing it.
paragraph.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Looks like we get one more minute, and I thought it was
One more
kind of,
minute.
I thought it was interesting how many times they said, "Do not be afraid."
Pastor Tim. Pastor Tim.
Can you mute?
Go ahead.
The phrase "do not be afraid" was mentioned many times. I just thought that was interesting.
Mhm.
All right, let's bring it back together again, and we'll try to do that every week as an opportunity just to kind of get some of the questions and insights rolling around, because it's fun to hear. Sometimes when you're reading it in by yourself, it's like, well, am I the only one that thinks this? Or sometimes it's fun to hear other people what they've heard. Any questions or insights that you want to share with the whole group? Yes.
Yeah.
We have two.
Only one each, so.
So we have ours. 37.
Okay.
Toward the bottom of the page, the last sentence, next to last sentence in the next to last paragraph. Isn't this the cup my master drinks from and also uses for divination?
Divination.
We kind of thought that was maybe something you're not supposed to be doing. And it seems like Joseph is, I don't know, staring into cups or something.
Ah, yeah. Reading the tea leaves per se?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, good. What's the other question?
The other one was on page 41. Where it says, 41, the first full paragraph, it says, Israel is saying to Joseph, if I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh.
Ah,
I don't know. what-
Get a little handsy,
Right.
for a promise.
Right.
Oh, there you
yeah. Good one. What other questions came up?
You'll talk about them.
I will, yep.
I was wondering if Joseph's brothers had not done this, would God have provided some other way for
Hmm,
Joseph to get to Egypt? Because that's not a very nice thing that the brothers did, but did God let them do that? And was that why they
mhm.
got where he was supposed to be?
That's what I thought. I thought it was God's plan for the whole thing.
So does God plan evil things?
That's a
No,
bigger question.
It turned out not to be evil. A lot of prosperity occurred.
Less things happen. I was just wondering.
Yeah, that's a good question. Does God plan evil things?
It kind of
That's-
came up too with the famine, where it said this was all part of, said something in there, God planned it this
Uh-huh.
way, this 7 years of famine, it's like, yikes.
Yeah, so there's tomes written on this, around it's called theocracy. And it does a supreme being, does God run the world in one of two ways, right? There's theory on this, right? That the world is evolving. It was created and it changes as things go on, and God dips in and out of those situations, right? Essentially, God is active in things, but things have their own ability to move, do, and have their being, and God is working with that. Or is the world like a spinning top? God created it, pulled the cord, let this top go, right? And eventually the top falls over. But it's all planned, right? From start to beginning, right? And there's major moves in theology around which one you kind of understand or believe, right? That's why we have the whole pieces of the puzzle. Everything happens for a reason, right? Or, God has planned all these things out for a reason. Right? You've heard that one maybe before, right? So that's one of the ways that people talk about it. Another is just the activity of which God enters in and out. And I think this question of does God plan evil things continues to get played out all the way through Scripture, even into Revelation, I would say.
Well, we were talking about, bad things happen to good people.
Uh,
And isn't that sort of the same thing? Or we don't live in heaven.
we don't live in heaven.
We certainly don't.
Yep, that's a good way of putting it. Sin has entered into this world, right? Another way of saying that is that there's a piece of which God forms the world, which is formless and void. Some places it talks about it's in chaos, right? Orders the chaos into existence, right? Putting it into some sort of natural order or natural law, and then the movement from what was in the garden, right, into more about kind of the existence of how humanity works. Sin enters into the situation. Back when we were talking about this back in the tree in the garden. So
Is original sin part of Lutheran theology? That came from the Catholic
that's a
Church.
Catholic, yep, that is a Catholic doctrine, right? We believe that sin is in the world and has existed within the world.
Mhm.
Not necessarily the fall is the creation of sin. Essentially, that sin is a part
But
of
not
the
like your
order,
newborn baby's
order
born
of
with sin.
chaos.
You know, it depends on when you grew up. Okay,
Yeah.
well, Lutheran Church changed some of their thinking or made it quiet. And when I grew
So
up,
did the Catholic Church.
I knew the first place my children should go was to church and be baptized because we were
Yeah.
taught in catechism and our parents felt that way. And I have pictures of me being baptized when I was so small you could hardly see me in the blankets. But then that stopped happening after my kids were baptized. And I asked the pastor, what happened, what happened to this thought? And he actually said, we don't talk much about original sin anymore.
That's good.
Right.
Because God has God's grace and mercy. We believe in grace and mercy. God's not going to send those babies to hell because they weren't baptized. I don't think we believe that now.
We don't, we have so if you remember when we talked about direction, like God, so Lutherans are all about God's action into this world, right? So God's coming, the incarnation of God into the world through Jesus Christ, but also just other ways that God has come into the world. So it's a downward arrow, right? When it comes to that, Luther talks about, and I think the scripture bears out, that we know through baptism, salvation happens. 100%, right? That in baptism, covenant is formed. Think about the covenants that we've talked about, Noah, Abraham. We'll continue to talk about those. Outside of that, as Lutherans, we rely on God's grace, but we don't have the specific promise, right? So early on, right, there was a lot of conversation about you need to have the baby baptized right away, right? Why? Because the emphasis that is put on baptism being done at the point, because then you rest in the promises and the assurance. Your death happens in baptism, and your new life is given to you in baptism. It's a different life. It's more of the spiritual sense of things, like not your physical death, obviously, but your spiritual life. Is transformed in the words and waters of baptism. That's our understanding of baptism, right? And that one baptism is good no matter what. When God makes a promise, God never leaves that promise, right? That there's nothing that you will do that God will break God's promise with you. Same thing that happens with all the rest of the covenants.
So what do the Jews believe about
they
children coming into the world?
Yeah. So this is a more tricky question. Jewish people now,
Yes.
or where we find it in the scriptures.
Well, both, I guess.
The afterlife really isn't the thing that is taken up in the Old Testament,
Okay.
or of really much concern.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really about practices that happen here and now. That's Greek, much more of a Greek philosophy that enters in. Now, it happens that you'll read in the New Testament, right? One of the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees are issues around resurrection of the dead, right? Even Martha says to Lazarus, the dead, surely I know he will raise on the day of resurrection, right? The concept around resurrection was not one that we talk about in the Old Testament, right? It's not seen there. And I don't think it was of concern, right? It was more of a here and now. God is active in this world, and less of the welcoming of God's people into God's place. Now, Jesus, of course, takes that up when he goes to hell, right? And talks about that in that nature. But for folks here, I think when you're talking about issues around salvation and promise and covenant, you're dealing with different things depending on your different areas of Judaism. Right, so the ultra Orthodox would probably say the covenant is cut with the individual when circumcision happens after 8 days.
That's what I thought, but girls aren't circumcised.
And there's a different way of, and I'm not familiar with that. You'd have to ask somebody who's Jewish on that one.
That's just the men. Yeah, that's what,
Well, that's what counts.
yeah. I'll ask my son-in-law.
Yeah, see if they,
Because the children are Jewish.
Yeah.
And he's Jewish. And I think my stepdaughter is Jewish now too. They haven't told us
okay.
yet.
And it depends on which form of Judaism that they are active in, or
I'm guessing a pretty Orthodox,
Orthodox Judaism.
or not Orthodox,
Reform.
Reformed, conservative.
Reform.
Okay.
Reform.
So in the reform, yeah, and the traditions are different
Modern.
within inside those even. So something good questions to ask as you work on it, because it's so different.
Mhm.
One of my college friends was Jewish, and she once said to me, I do not get this Christian obsession with after death.
Oh,
And I was like, never thought about it. And she was like, why will I think about it? I'll be dead. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
But she completely, she's like, it's morbid. Especially
Well,
when it's kind of
I asked-
dependent on following the law. She just doesn't think about it. It's a completely different
It's a different way of,
approach to God and
God's active here and now and in this time and space.
Well,
It's less.
my my son-in-law's parents are Jewish, and they were conservative, and then they went to the Reform, and they just said something happened within the conservative movement that they didn't agree with. So, so they're Reformed now. And I asked her, I said, do Jews believe in an afterlife? And she said, yes, we believe in an afterlife,
Mhm.
but it's not like heaven, you know.
Yeah,
it's-
you see that
or
in
hell or anything, you know.
again, you see that right away in the New Testament, that is started to change, but it's dependent on which area that you are brought up in,
Yeah.
your synagogue, and even your rabbi to this, to a certain extent.
Okay.
So,
I'll have to research.
the divination piece. So this is always a piece that gets brought up into the question of what is the cup's purpose of divination? Is the reading of tea leaves? Christians will read into that. The cup is what? Cup of salvation, this idea that you have some sort of special service. What I've heard it explained as is that it's a cup that is used in a religious service of some nature. So the access to it, it has to deal that it has more power. It'd be like, I wouldn't take the chalice we use for communion and grab a cup of water and pour it in there. You would think that that would be weird, right? If I were to do that here, right? And I wouldn't be eating my cupcake off of a patent either, right? It
Yeah.
just doesn't work. It's not that I couldn't, it's a cup. Sure, it's a cup and it's a plate, right? And you can definitely eat off of it and drink off of it. It doesn't, but you have set aside this. And next week, we'll talk about what holy looks like. Because holiness is something that's really, so we talked about creation and then faith. And holiness is really the next chapter's kind of frame. That means being set apart. And we'll talk about what does holy look like here. We think holiness happens in space and time, but holiness can happen all over the time. So we'll talk about that next week. But so in terms of divination, these things are set apart, right? And so was it used for some sort of service to an Egyptian god? Possibly. Is it tea leaves? I don't know. Is it? But essentially, that's how it's been explained to me. I think it makes sense. I don't think Joseph is actively idol worshiping, but again, wouldn't be too far off. We haven't gotten to the 10 Commandments. There's a lot of different things that get brought in throughout time and space. He's been in Egypt for a long time. Thighs, right? We all love good chicken thighs, right? They're really nice and tasty, full of meat. They're just tough to take out the bones, right? So those boneless chicken thighs have been one of the greatest inventions of all time. But what we see in the body oftentimes is that we miss the Hebrew understanding. Most of the things, Pastor John alluded to this a few weeks ago when he was talking about Jonah's anger, right? And that when it says it in the Hebrew, it doesn't say that he got angry, it says that his nose got hot, right? And we've talked about nephesh, which is soul, translated as soul in the Old Testament, but it really means your throat. And that your plexus, your guts hold is where your emotions come from. We talk about it as our heart, right? Our heart holds this. Your heart doesn't hold that. That's where your kidneys hold, right? Each of these body parts have been given a role, right? And they have movement in them. Now, oftentimes we have used the emotion and things like that. So when he grabs his thighs, right? This is the place where it's a very, you don't let anybody touch your thighs, right? If I went up,
That's where they talk about the sinews.
no, that would be the connecting nature of things, right? Yeah, but the thigh would be a space that is reserved for close companions.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
If I went up and grabbed Marilyn's thigh, you might have to have a conversation with Pastor John after this, right? I mean, it is not a place that you let many people touch, even though it's a very public place, right? You don't go and grab people's thighs. And so in doing so, you are engaging in a space and place that has deeper significance. So you would, when you were creating covenants, when you were creating promises, you made yourself uncomfortable to ensure it's similar. So a way that we do it, that we know it now, when you were taught to pray, how were you taught to pray? Fold your hands and bow your head. Why?
So you're not distracted.
No,
Respect.
no,
Show reverence.
Pay attention.
no. Well, part show reverence.
Like submission.
When you put out your hands like this, you show that you have no weapon. When you bow your head before the king, you are giving the most vulnerable spot in your body open for attack. The back of your neck. If you get hit in the back of your neck, you're done, right? They knew that way back when, right? And so when you approach the king, you did the same thing. You put your hands out. In fact, they were talking about this when Zoom started. We actually have a physiological thing where we need to see people's hands. And you actually get uncomfortable if you were to meet somebody, and if you were to approach somebody like this on the street, you would start to get uncomfortable. Your body, whether you know it or not, is always aware of where people's hands are. It's part of our fight or flight thing. Went to this big speech when Zoom started, that they said when you started in Zoom, you should do this. Why? Because subconsciously, everyone on Zoom becomes more comfortable because they know where your hands are, and instead of just your face, right? And so it follows, Marcia, to go on your question, it follows that very similar line, right? You have your hands out, so you don't have a weapon, you're exposing and it's a position then of reverence or of submission, right? But that's why we formed it, right? It doesn't mean, when people are praying, what the Old Testament says is you should lift your nephesh to the Lord. You should pray like this then, right? We don't tend to do that, right? But that is your nephesh is the life source. Everything your body needs flows through your nephesh, your neck, your spinal cord, your blood, your air, all of that goes all through your, it is your source. Without your neck, you dead, right? Or if your neck gets crushed, it's gone, right? And so follows that similar path, right? So anytime you want to make a covenant, just grab someone's tie. Yeah,
So it's more like about the intimacy of the gesture
Right.
and trust. And
right.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Do people that study the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Even if they're Christian.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
they
Rachel.
study I saw someone pray with their hands out like this.
Yeah,
And maybe even looking up, but we don't usually do that, but it was a scholar.
it's an openness, right? Yeah, praying. You can pray to God however you want to.
But is it typical of a scholar of Jewish?
No, I think it's probably
Studies.
typical of people who want to express. They feel like this is closed up, and they feel more comfortable opening up.
That's how you do in the Catholic Church
Praise.
when you say the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
You open your
Well,
hands like
and-
this
and
grab
doesn't
your-
the minister
If you're
open
Right.
his hands during the service, what the Catholics call the consecration.
So that's part of this, right? And if you'll notice when we pray, when I go between the oh,
Announcements. and then-
no, the oh
The
my goodness,
consecration.
yeah, but it's a prayer of no. No, it's the words of institution, but it's all anyway, whatever the prayer so the words of institution, and then there's prayer before and after it, right? That's where, so after we sing the liturgy and then we say the prayer, the words of institution, then there's prayer after it, right? Remembering then, if you'll notice what I do, between this spot and then we move to the Lord's Prayer, we go like this. Right? So it's a slight movement, but it's an encompassing movement, right? Instead of lifting, it's a movement for us to do like this. So now that was something that was taught to me by my worship professor. So it's not necessarily something that everyone does, but that was an encouragement. Again, it's a slight movement to encourage a different form of lifting up, right? We're kind of doing this together. I think huddle, right? Type of thing. So,
Pastor Tim.
yes.
Yeah, since Karen's at work, she asked me to go ahead and ask the question that she had. She had noticed a couple times, and I did too, that it mentioned that they tore their clothes. I didn't get the significance of that.
Yeah. So tearing your clothes is not something we do often here, right? If you get really mad at me, you're probably not going to rip off your shirts, right? Because that would be a different piece of it. So the other thing is that you have a whole wardrobe full of clothes at your house, right? You have more clothes than you even know what to do with. You can go shopping in your own closets typically. And that's the case for a lot of Americans, right? For folks in this space, it was a sign that you only had one, right? Maybe you had a couple cloaks that you would put on when it got cold, but it wasn't like you had multiple sets of clothes. And so to tear your clothes was a physical representation of anger or grief, or something wasn't going right, right? You are stripping away. Later, you'll see ashes mounted on their heads as they go into signs of grief, and they put on sackcloth. I actually really like the idea. I wish we had a ritual in the United States to show that somebody was in a grief process. We used to, and we let that go. I think that's terrible. I think if we had a way that somebody could signify that they are in the process of losing somebody and mourning grief in the grocery store or on the roadways where we could see, I think we'd have a lot more compassion for people.
We're all black for a long time.
Yeah. And I think we used to have a lot more signs of that. We have lost that, but this would be the outward sign to others in your life, essentially outward notion that something isn't going right.
They used to wear armbands, men wore armbands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, again, I think it's really helpful, because if you're dealing, think about when you have grief or something going on in your life, you're not exactly on A game, right? And let's say somebody else who's not on A game, but they're just, pissed because, their team lost or something like that, right? And they're kind of being gruff to you or something. You would be able to have a lot more compassion to be with people in a different way. And we have the capacity to do it. We just don't have the visual cue. And I think if we had a visual cue, or you just see somebody crying, you're in the cereal aisle and you see somebody crying, you may go and console them if you know that they're have the whatever thing on that means that we're sad, right? You might offer to them a tissue or be with them. You see someone crying in the cereal aisle, you're like, what's going on with that person? I don't know. You don't know, right? You don't know if they got in a fight on the phone and or at home or what's going on, right? It's always good to offer a kind word.
Well, they used to drape your front door too.
Yeah, drape it in black.
They used to
So-
have more visual signs.
We used to have more interaction in our homes, but that's a different. So that's why it's a physical representation of something that's not going right in your world. And that would be a signal to everyone else that's something very tragic has happened, or that it's not just like, oh, somebody ate my cupcake. It's like, somebody, really did something very wrong, or I'm very sad. Any other questions online?
Well, would the result of that be you walked around without your shirt on? And is that the sign that?
Could be, or it could be tattered. Yep, until you had new clothes made. So. All right, Joseph in 15 minutes. Let's go. We have a lot to cover. I wish I couldn't, I don't know what happened to him. I had confirmands make up a graphic novel of Joseph. I'm gonna use that tonight. My favorite line of the whole graphic novel was, so Joseph was basically Harry Styles. That was my favorite line. And awesome, Harry Styles is one of the teen throbs right now, right? And you think of the Potiphar's wife piece. That's cool that they are making a connection between something in their life and what Joseph may be represented in that certain scenario. I thought that was really neat. And a really cool way that they are now exploring and knowing the Bible, I think, in a way that they will take home with them. As they're navigating this. So it was fun. But page 26, I wanted to highlight that as we are in the story. 26 is a sign of, it has Jacob's story. So if you remember following this along, Jacob wanted to marry Rachel, ended up marrying Leah, right? But Jacob just decides that he wants to, sleep with everyone. So
Leonardo DiCaprio.
yeah, right, yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio. So Jacob is Leo, and Joseph is Harry Styles. So you'll see then the sons that come from Reuben is the oldest, and if you read the story in the scriptures, you get more on that. Reuben, and then Judah, Levi, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun. And then Rachel's sons are Joseph and Benjamin. And the only reason this is important is because Rachel was the one that Jacob wanted to marry. And so the oldest son of Rachel is Joseph. And that is why Joseph gets this coat with the long sleeves. That's why Jacob loves him the most. He's the oldest of Rachel, not the oldest, not even close to the oldest, right? And so you see Jacob has 12 sons with 4 women.
So there are 2 Leahs.
No, Leah's servant.
Why is Leah in there twice? Just because the kids were born in bunches?
The orders.
Okay,
Yep,
okay.
yep. So if you read it in the scriptures, it'll read in order of how they came across.
Okay.
This is kind of confusing because you're going from top down. You should
Yeah.
really read from bottom up,
Right,
and that's the order of the kids.
Okay.
In 7th grade, I played the role of Gad in Joseph Mays Technicolor Dreamcoat. My line was, Gad. That was it.
You did
I-
it well.
Darn right. Emphasis on the G. Clearly enunciated the Gad. I can do that for you anytime you need. Just so you know. Still remember it, and that was what I did. So Joseph has these 12 sons, and he has 1 daughter. The daughter's not talked about in the story, but the daughter's name is Dinah. Dinah's raped. And that happens again, as we talk about the scriptures, there's really intense things that come up right away at the beginning of the scriptures. And a number of people have been bringing these things up as we've read through the story and reminded of how PG-13 these stories really are, not sometimes full out R rating. And so wanted to just kind of highlight that happens, and it's a good story to go back and read if you're looking to dig into this deeper. Anyway, Joseph gets the coat with long sleeves. It's not a coat of many colors. It can be translated that, but it's probably the coat of long sleeves, because if you have long sleeves on, it's harder to work in the fields, right? And so he gets that. Joseph, of course, knows that he has this interpretation of dreams, and he's kind of snotty-nosed. He tells his brothers about how much they're going to serve him. What do you expect? If you have siblings and you start to talk about how I'm going to rule over you, you'll bow down to me one day. Guess what? You get thrown against the wall or pinned to the ground or beat up. I mean, siblings aren't the kindest in nature when they're young, and that's what happens. And so they see him out there and they throw him into this pit, and he is rescued by a band of Ishmaelites. On page 30, it says that the caravan of Ishmaelites came up, and so they wanted to trade him, right? So Joseph becomes a slave, and human trafficking happens at this point, right? Potiphar purchases Joseph. Joseph is purchased. He's a slave that is purchased here, right? And so Potiphar purchased. This follows along with the trickery that continues to happen in Jacob's and Joseph's life. It just happens over and over again. Remember that Jacob tricked Esau out of his birthright through Isaac, right? Esau came in and he was hungry. He wanted a bowl of red lentil soup. And he wanted the red lentil soup. And so Esau said, fine, take whatever you want, right? He tricked him. And then Isaac, he brought in some stuff, and he dressed in camel's hair. And so that Isaac was blind, obviously couldn't tell who it was, but gave the blessing over to Jacob. Well, that didn't turn out well for Jacob, right? Jacob had to flee. And so, but this trickery then continues in his life. It's like, if you want to live a life of tricking people, it will come back to you. Maybe not in a sense of karma, but in the sense that that's the kind of seeds, the ground you sow in. You live in that land, and the boys do it to him, right? They take goat's blood, soaked long sleeves. See that jacket you gave him? This is what we're going to do to it. Soak it in goat's blood. Give it back to you, right? Anyway, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar is sold by the Ishmaelites. Again, Ishmael is the son of Hagar and Abraham, and also in the line of Islam, right? One of the fathers of Islam. And how tightly those are sewed together. So going back to the question, would God have found another way, right? It's interesting how this now, not many chapters away, we see this tying back in of how the Ishmaelites actually saved Joseph to continue in this process. So who knows what they would have done in the pit? They could have just left him down there. Wild animal could have gotten down there. All sorts of things could have happened. Then he's done. So Joseph goes into this house, and the Lord was with Joseph on page 31. When that line is in anything, it tends to be good. When the Lord is with the people, when the Lord is with them in battle or wherever, life goes well. And it's not Joseph that's doing this. It's because the Lord is with Joseph, right? It's not that Joseph is so smart or able or capable, but that God's presence is there. And so his work is prospered. Think Psalm 90. Prosper the work of my hands, O Lord, prosper the work of my hands. And so when you see this, then Joseph is at work, things are going well. Potiphar's like, hey man, we love keeping you around, you're doing great. And Potiphar's wife sees Harry Styles and says, ooh la la, right? And this is a section where even feminist scholars will not give her a break. She was, this is not a sign where Potiphar's wife was under some sort of derision, or there was this was a very clear use of power over a slave in this case, right? And so she doesn't get any sort of pass on this, but he flees out, leaves his cloak. Potiphar comes home, right? She says, he was trying to make sport of me. That's how they put it in this. Make sport of me. Oh, that's an interesting translation.
Well, well, I mean, among young single people, there's a term
Sure.
that uses sport for the marital act.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they scream. Now, this is the interesting piece of the story, because Joseph is a slave. So what would Potiphar do to a slave that he thought had tried to seduce his wife? Kill him. So Potiphar, what's missed here is that Potiphar actually doesn't believe her, probably, because he is just cast into jail. There's really no reason why he should have lived, right? He's just a slave.
He said he burned with anger.
Yeah, but he didn't kill him. And well, whatever might be there, right? There is something there though, that he wasn't killed, right? And he was put into jail. Could have been just say, you done me good, so we're gonna let you, live. But there's something more there. There's some grace that is led there. Now Potiphar or Joseph will go down, he'll interpret dreams in the prison, then he comes back out. That person happens to be the cupbearer, I think, of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is complaining because he's had these dreams, he doesn't understand them. And the cupbearer says to him, hey, I know a guy, which is always good. It's always good to know a guy. And Joseph gets brought up. We know the piece of the puzzle where he gets this. And then he gets risen to the ranks of deputy Pharaoh, right? Essentially, Pharaoh says, I'm going to be Pharaoh, but you're going to do everything else. Which is either a really nice of the Pharaoh, or like, I just don't want to do it. I can blame you if things go bad, right? So it's a one or it's not exactly vice presidentship, but it's kind of like, if things don't go so well, I'll just blame Pharaoh, or this deputy Pharaoh Joseph, and kill him and raise somebody else up to deputy Pharaoh. That way I don't get the heat. I can still live and have fun. So it's either good or bad. Anyway, because Joseph does this, though, lots of people's lives are saved, right? As he has done. And it's good to point out that Joseph even says in this, it's not me that's going to interpret the dream, but God will interpret the dream, right? Joseph is clear about the subject-object understanding. If you remember what we talked about, God is the subject, we are the object, right? Remember when we talked about that? Joseph follows that clearly, right? He understands who's the subject. We are the object, right? And Joseph always is good about making sure that the subject is brought up. Now, all these situations happen, these brothers come down, they try to get their food, they do. Joseph wants to know about Benjamin, that's his brother, and Jacob, his dad. So they work a way out to getting them there. You know, that's interesting part of the story. I don't know what else we necessarily want to cover. There's a lot more to the story, but we're at our time. So is there any more questions kind of at the tail end of the story?
This is, you don't have to elaborate right now because I know we're out of time, but so this Joseph is the one that the Mormons follow. No,
That's Joseph Smith.
okay, that's a different, okay,
Joseph Smith is a third testamental. It's a whole different,
whole different thing.
yeah.
Okay.
How about using food to get what you want?
Yeah.
Questioning that.
Why does Joseph act in such a way, right? He acts kind of mean,
Yeah.
you know, and at the end he's grace-filled, right? He does give them all that they need and want. Returns Jacob back home and all these types of things, but it's not, you know, it's not like maybe we would imagine it to happen.
Well, Marcia, when we were talking, I said, this is a story about pies, and she was like, it's a story about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Because I thought that was a really good way to frame it, you know, that he forgives them. They threw him in a hole and sold him.
And sold him into slavery,
He
right?
forgives them.
There's some trauma there.
Yeah.
And yet, he comes to find forgiveness. They end up being, you know, bowing to him, right? His dream comes true. All of his dreams come true, right? And that's a piece of that.
And his father's dream.
And his father.
See him again.
Yep, his father and Pharaoh's. That these visions are coming into being. Now,
So God is behind all this.
God is active in it.
Mhm.
It's either God is active or God is behind it.
Well,
Did God
I
make
mean,
it all
either
happen?
way, it's God's doing.
Or is God working in the situation
Yeah.
through brokenness and sinfulness?
I think they use food because for all of us, we don't have food.
Yeah.
We have
Stuff.
to make it.
Stuff, yeah. Yeah. Right. It makes things a lot harder if you're not eating.
Especially
For
over
seven
we
years.
didn't even comprehend
Yes.
what that's like, because we've never been through a famine or anything like that, you know, where there's no food.
Right. And
But they had to store it
the
up.
likelihood, even in COVID, right? I mean, everybody was like, they're gonna close all the stores. We're all gonna die of hunger. It's like, no, I think we all could probably live on years with the food that are stored in our houses, right? If we actually need it. So this all comes to fruition in next chapter as you think of this story, and it plays out at the very beginning of this. It's one of my favorite lines. And it's translated here, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. But in the NRSV, I think it's, then arose a king who did not know who Joseph was, nor the works that he had done. And I think that is such a powerful line if you understand the story of Joseph going into Exodus. And what does that actually mean when we have leaders that are come to power that do not know our history or the history of people? There's a whole lot to unpack in that one line. We can think of even in our own lives. What does it mean that we maybe don't know or recognize the ancestors that have come before us in our faith life?
What I've learned is that's why historians are so important in the workplace. For the new, well, I worked in management, and if you have a historian at your side, they can affect a lot of your decisions because you know what happened in the past.
Mhm. Mhm.
And historians are very important
Mhm.
in the workplace anyway.
Yeah,
I think it's important in government too.
Yeah.
Because if government,
Yeah.
if you don't understand countries and their deal, their ideas and what their needs are, land or water or food or respect, then the person that comes to this position in government
That's
is
true.
at is zero, hasn't got any, could have.
your faith is formed also.
That's what I do in our government, especially the federal government. I depend on the career workers because they have the history. And they don't always have the influence they should have, but they're our safety valve.
There you go. Well, something to talk about next week is we do the first half of Genesis 1 through 20 essentially is where we're going. Genesis 20 is where 10 Commandments are. That's where we'll go in 2 weeks and we'll explore that. I have a fun video actually that we might use for that. It's just a humorous one. We're gonna use it in confirmation, and I think it's kind of lighthearted and funny to watch.
So chapter 4 takes in
Chapter
all of
4.
that.
Chapter 4 is Moses.
Okay, and then you said,
Chapter 5 is the new commandments.
oh,
Yep. So in confirmation, I have one of my former colleagues from Georgia. He's gonna zoom in as Moses. And we're gonna have a conversation about what it's like. Well, tell us more about yourself. What is something that you want to talk about? So it's gonna be interesting. He's just such a good guy. He went back, he reread all of the stories of Moses, and he's got things that he wants to talk about, so I think it'll be fun to watch Mike. And now all of our confirmands are gonna think Moses has a Southern accent. Moses. So, yep. All right. Good to see everybody online.
Thank you.
how about your birthday?
Oh,
Yeah, grab a cupcake.